This is an e-learning course brought to you by Contemplative Light. We are a community of spiritual teachers and writers, graciously offering our insight, experience, and most importantly, our love. We hope you enjoy your course.
Hi, and welcome to Contemplative Light's course on the Christian mystics. And the first question to address as we begin is, what exactly is mysticism? What is Christian mysticism? And why do people tend to get a little suspicious around this topic? And so there are historical reasons for that, and we want to address that here in the introduction. So first of all, a mystic is someone who's had some kind of radical awakening experience, some direct contact with the divine, with God, that transcends concepts and transcends language. That ineffability seems to be a thread that runs through the experience of the mystics. But that experience brings about a radical inner transformation on the level of their inmost being, on the level of consciousness itself in some way. But already, even with that definition, we're in some difficulty because we're trying to talk about something that cannot be expressed. So there's always some mystery surrounding this topic, and we can touch on some of its aspects, but of course not exhaustively or comprehensively articulate what mysticism is. The word mystic, of course, shares its root etymologically with mystery. And the theological term for the great mystery of God is the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the great and fascinating or wondrous mystery. And the key is that experiential component. The mystic tends toward conveying an experience and trying to bring about that experience for others rather than oftentimes being sort of theologically oriented, although there are exceptions to that. So one writer we keep coming back to as a reference and a kind of guide along this path to make sense of the mystics, to situate them within their historical context, to interpret some of their, at times, difficult or obscure writings, someone who can kind of trace the interrelationships between them and situate them within the context of the thought of their day as well, is Evelyn Underhill. And her monumental work, simply titled Mysticism, has been a go-to text for us at Contemplative Light, really since the beginning. And we highly recommend getting a copy of it. And if you're a voracious reader, go ahead and read through. If you're not, and you just want to kind of find selections to digest here and there, that's another way to go about it. But here is her attempt to kind of capture what a mystic is. To be a mystic, she writes, is simply to participate here and now in that real and eternal life, in the fullest, deepest sense which is possible to man. It is to share as a free and conscious agent, not a servant, but a son, in the joyous travail of the universe. Its mighty onward sweep through pain and glory towards its home in God. This gift of sonship, this power of free cooperation in the world process, is man's greatest honor. So she has a very elevated notion of the mystics and their contribution to humanity in general. So one way to think about mysticism is as the experiential core of spirituality, out of which religious practice grows. It's the seed, the experience itself, and then stories, teachings, metaphors, rituals, practices grow out of that experience to communicate something of it, to preserve it and pass it on. And there's a ton more we could say by way of introduction and definition, but we've included a helpful link below to a piece by our friend Carl McColman, who writes a lot on this topic, that might help extend some of this introductory definition. So there's a rich history of figures who've had some experience of inner transformation within the Christian tradition. And these are the figures we'll be exploring in this course. The Christian mystics are unique and peculiar figures, leading an awakened and awakening life, who are never satisfied with less than complete union with the divine. That's a key concept interwoven throughout the lives of the mystics, is divine union. And almost invariably, this process of inner transformation leads to an infusion of energy, an outburst of activity in these people, in some contrast to the popular conception of the mystic as somehow detached or a remote sort of hermit. While it is in fact true that mystics often remove themselves from society, that's usually for a specific period of time. They go into the desert, the wilderness, the liminal space, often called the cave experience, and some literally went to caves. But that is it serves a purpose. It's functional. It is a time to engage in the deep inner work, to confront the shadow, in a sense, the sinful nature, the false self, are other terms for it. And it's to undergo a rigorous process and open oneself to the inner transformation, and to bring back that transformation for others. That is a key that's often misunderstood. And but also, this has been a group and a way of thought that is that ruffles feathers, that has caused waves, that is seen as sort of subversive to the status quo in many faith traditions, and oftentimes the mystic is viewed suspiciously. And one reason for that is theological. The mystic's understanding of God differs from that is often sort of institutionalized. Some of that goes back to the formation of the Catholic Church after the conquest of Constantine, and establishing the official and formal religion of the empire as the Christian faith. And once spirituality or faith becomes aligned with political power, that opens the floodgates for inauthenticity, for corruption, for oppression, for exploitation, and also for abstraction, for the theology to become a kind of ego trip or means of organizing and maintaining a hierarchy and maintaining a power structure, versus an authentically lived out experience, which is always what the mystic is after. And for the most part, in the Western religious tradition, we have this mental framework in which the human is separate from God. We are the created. We are lower on the divine hierarchy. God is somehow at a distance, and even in the certain theological frameworks, it's only the life, death, resurrection of Christ as the incarnation who somehow bridges that gap between us as the fallen human and the divine God. Whereas the mystic sees us as already always participating in God, always within God, rather than separate from. For the mystic, God is at all times and everywhere present, and through the process of inner transformation, the ego that keeps us separate from God gradually dissolves more and more, and we embrace that divine reality. We're invited into what Richard Rohr calls the divine dance, the perichoresis of the Trinity that's always in motion, and we are invited to become participants in that process that is always already happening. And the experience of the mystic then is, in a sense, the process of dissolving that ego. And that always leads to a certain non-participation in some of the ego games that are happening around us. And at different times throughout history, that has gotten mystics in trouble with the existing either cultural, political, or religious powers of their day. And that's something we'll explore as well. So in her monumental work, Mysticism, the late 19th century, early 20th century author Evelyn Underhill, synthesizing the work of centuries really of Christian mystics, describes the mystical journey as a set of stages or phases, which are not always linear, and usually involve some kind of oscillation between pleasure and pain. That ego, that gradual dissolution of the ego, it seems to involve some kind of pain of release. Sometimes the release of accumulated pain within that becomes a kind of means of transformation, or a hallmark of moving from one stage to another. There's some kind of death involved to move through these stages. And the first stage is usually awakening. And that oftentimes comes at the end of some life trauma, some strain, some difficulty, sometimes prolonged inner tension of some kind. And there's this awakening to the divine reality of the nature of spirit and the mystic's connection to spirit. And that is then usually followed by purgation, a purgation of habits, purgation of processes, ego dynamics, maybe learning the structure of one's own ego tendencies, wounds, processes, and the effort is in some sense to align one's life more with this newfound awakening experience and open oneself to receive more and more. Always in the Christian tradition, the gift of contemplative prayer, of growth along this mystical path or movement along the path, is always seen as a grace. It's something we are called to, that we are moved to by God initiating that process, and that our task is not to affect the growth itself, which is always a grace, but to open ourselves to it. So first is awakening, then purgation, then third is illumination, or education along this path of what it looks like. There's usually a mentorship involved, and understanding what precisely this movement and motion looks like and how it affects our inner being. Maybe there's a deepening or intensification of some sort of spiritual or contemplative practice that opens one up more and more to the divine mystery, during the illumination phase. And usually that is followed up with some sort of final purification. There is some core wound, some central issue that sort of the greatest of mystics undergo. This dark night of the soul, which is not to be confused with sort of depression or struggle, but is a kind of final ego death where maybe even physically this manifests, but certainly spiritually, of a sense of God's withdrawal and the inability on the part of the mystic to find a source of comfort or pleasure or sustenance. This purification then dissolves the ego. It's like dipping the ego in acid, is how one mystic puts it, and certainly sort of a psychic pain associated with that. But then this final dissolution of the ego in the fifth stage, which is union with the divine, and the ability to sort of become a pure channel for divine love into the world. In a sense, effortlessly. You simply are becoming a manifestation of that divine love. One way to get a hold of the bundle of the Christian mystics is through understanding the three eras of flowering, of kind of golden eras of mysticism. And they tend to come on the heels historically of cultural flowering. It's as if eras of theological or scholastic or artistic, scientific discovery and growth are then capped off by some mystical flowering. The great mystics tend to come kind of just after eras we think of as historically sort of heightened achievement in culture and the arts. These three eras are first in the 3rd century, that we call the early or classical mystics, and then in the 14th century, the medieval mystics, coming on the heels of the great achievements of the medieval cathedrals, medieval poetry with Dante, medieval theology and scholasticism with Thomas Aquinas. And these are then followed up by this spiritual influx into the mystical life. And then again in the 17th century, there's this post-Renaissance flowering of the mystics, and or also sometimes called early modern, with mystics like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. Now, another way to kind of get a hold of this bundle is not necessarily in these historical eras, but in sort of mystical types. Now, some authors have come up with kind of a variety of types and ways to categorize different of the Christian mystics, but we're going to go with 4. And these 4 mystical types are, first, the visionary, the mystic who experiences some divine transcendent vision of wholeness. It can be of divine beauty. It can manifest itself in a kind of artistic flowering or poetic expression. But that is a consistent theme throughout the Christian mystics, or consistent thread of the visionary. And then the lover, someone who is infused with divine grace and is able to become a kind of center of gravity, that draws others into their orbit, into their sphere, and becomes a means of kind of infusing divine love outward into the world, out of their own inner transformation. That they may not be great scholars, writers, poets, or artists, but they enact this divine love in the world. And then unitives. These are figures who may not be great community organizers. They may not be sort of charismatic leaders, though some are. They are able to have that unitive vision and articulate it in a way that it transforms the lenses for others. And then is the fourth group, the iconoclasts. And somehow these are figures who, throughout their life and teaching, stand at odds with the authority figures, whether political or religious, of their day, and become either agents of change or sort of suffer the consequences of staying true to their radically transformative experiences and beliefs. And so another component, we need to address some key terms that are helpful along this teaching of mystical theology. And the first is apophatic, this Greek term we get from the early church fathers that is a kind of negative theology, or that posits that we know more about God by denying our concepts than by affirming them. Whatever God is, he transcends our ability to conceptualize and articulate. So any definition or articulation, if we try to define God, by necessity falls short. That we will never be able to encapsulate the totality of what God is through concepts and language. And that then points the way toward the need for direct experience of the divine. And that term apophatic stands in contrast to cataphatic or positive theology. And for the early church fathers and theologians, these weren't opposed. It was just that there was always going to be a limitation to cataphatic theology, or what you could communicate in a pulpit, what you could communicate in a classroom, what you could communicate amongst a body of believers, of establishing doctrine and a sort of standard belief set or theology to adhere to, that would always be ultimately inadequate to expressing the full range of what God is and what the potentialities of our relationship to the divine. And then in the medieval era, in Latin, that sort of negative way became communicated as the via negativa, or that negative theology of, on the one hand, denying concepts, but also on the experiential or spirituality side of the stripping away of ego to become more unified with God. For the early mystics especially, but this is a thread that runs through, is they interpreted Scripture through the lens of Neoplatonism. They interpreted their experience, specifically with the figure Plotinus, who was very influential for early mystical theologians. And especially his concept of oneness, or what we might call today non-duality or non-dual consciousness, that all things that we kind of carve up into different categories and assign and evaluate as good and bad, that all things are moving toward union and oneness, and in fact already kind of participate in that. And the process of spiritual development and maturity is to perceive that reality with that level of consciousness. And that's certainly a thread that informs the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius, who's the first Christian mystic we'll talk about, and then through him and St. Augustine, then kind of flows into the rest of the mystical writers and teachers. And then the idea of the Logos, which has been maintained more so in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and which is this kind of elemental energy underlying the visible and perceivable reality, this kind of potential energy that is an organizing principle that gives rise to form, to pattern, to beauty. And this concept of the Logos it was then identified with Christ in John's Gospel as the Word. In the beginning was the Word. The term for that in the original Greek is logos, and there is a kind of fundamental understanding within the mystical tradition, or certain aspects of it, certain teachers within the mystical tradition of the Logos. And then another term, kind of a little more theocentric versus that Christocentric teaching and understanding of the Logos, is theosis, or what we've described so far in this introduction as the divine union. So that term theosis, especially with the early Greek fathers, is also the organizing principle, the omega point, in a sense, of the spiritual life. That radical movement toward theosis, toward divine union, is sort of what it's all about. So we certainly hope you receive insight and learning and new nuggets that you take away from this course, but even more importantly, that some sort of fertile soil is cultivated within, and the potential for radical openness as well. At Contemplative Light, one of our core beliefs is in the necessity of practice and experience and immersion. But in this course, we're going to be taking a look back at 20 different Christian mystics, and to see how the divine life sort of manifests itself within them. And if you have one or another of your favorites who didn't make this initial cut, we've certainly got a follow-up course planned. This course specifically focuses on Western mystics, and we will include a little more of the Eastern tradition in future offerings. So enjoy.
This concludes our course. To learn more, please visit our website at www.contemplativelight.com. We look forward to seeing you again soon.